The courtyard fell silent. Mama Ijoma's finger was pointed straight at Adaeze's chest, her voice sharp enough to cut through the market noise beyond the gate. "You have brought nothing but bad luck into this family," she said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Amara stood beside her, arms crossed, smiling faintly at the humiliation. Chidi looked away. Adaeze said nothing. She simply held the folded kente cloth tighter against her chest, the only thing she had brought from home that no one in this compound could take from her. What none of them knew, standing there in the fading evening light, was that in 3 months this same family would be on their knees, begging a stranger named A.O. to save everything they had left. They had no idea the stranger was her. Adaeze Okonjo was born in a farming town 2 hours outside Kumasi, in a house with a tin roof that rattled every time the rains came hard in June. She was the eldest of 4 children, and from the time she could carry a bucket, she understood that her family's survival depended on everyone doing more than their share. Her father grew cassava and maize on a small plot of inherited land. Her mother sold vegetables at the roadside stall before dawn each day, balancing a basket on her head for the 3-mile walk into town. There was rarely enough money, and there was never enough time, but there was always work, and Adaeze did hers without complaint, because complaining changed nothing, and her mother had taught her that early. What set Adaeze apart from her siblings, even as a child, was the particular way her mind moved through a problem. When the family's only radio broke, she was the one who took it apart on the kitchen table, piece by piece, until she understood why it had stopped working. When her father's cousin brought an old, dust-covered computer to the house, a gift no one else knew what to do with, 12-year-old Adaeze spent an entire rainy season teaching herself to use it, typing out imaginary business ledgers just to see the numbers organize themselves into neat columns. She loved the feeling of chaos becoming order. It was the closest thing to magic she had ever touched. There was no money for university, not the kind of university that taught computer science, not for a farmer's daughter. But there was an internet cafe 3 towns over, run by a distant cousin who let her use an unclaimed hour of computer time in exchange for sweeping the floor after closing. Adaeze took that hour every single day for 4 years. She taught herself to code from tutorials that buffered and stalled on the cafe's slow connection. She read everything she could find about small business systems, inventory tracking, digital ledgers, supply chain management subjects that had nothing to do with her own life and everything to do with the life she intended to build. By the time she was 22, she had quietly built something no one in her village knew existed. A small, growing freelance consulting practice, helping local shopkeepers digitize their record keeping, one client at a time, under a professional name she'd chosen for herself, A. Okonjo Consulting. She kept it separate from her real life, the way some people keep a locked drawer. It was hers alone, and it was proof, even if no one else ever saw it, that she was more than what her circumstances suggested. It was at her cousin's wedding, in the dry heat of a February afternoon, that she met Chidi Mensah. He was the son of a respected trading family from Accra, in town for a business trip that had turned into an unplanned wedding invitation through a mutual relative. Adaeze had been asked to help coordinate the event's small logistics seating, timing, the dozens of tiny problems that arise at any large gathering, and Chidi found himself watching her solve them, calmly, one after another, without ever raising her voice or seeming flustered. He asked her, half in jest, whether she managed weddings for a living. She told him, without hesitation, that she managed systems weddings were just systems with more flowers. He laughed, and something in that laugh told her he had actually understood the joke, which surprised her more than she expected. They spoke for hours that evening, long after the music had faded and the guests had begun to leave. Chidi told her about his family's textile and general trading business, 3 generations old, proud of its history, but though he didn't quite say it outright, increasingly uneasy about its future. Adaeze told him almost nothing about her own quiet consulting work. It had never occurred to her that a man from his world would find it anything but strange for a woman to speak of business systems instead of the things women in his circles usually spoke of. What she did tell him was true and simple, that she believed in working hard, in solving problems instead of complaining about them, and in never asking for more credit than she'd earned. Their courtship moved quickly after that, the way things sometimes do when two people recognize something rare in each other. Within the year, Chidi asked for her hand, and within another few months, they were married in a modest ceremony that Adaeze's family could barely afford, and the Mensah family attended more out of politeness than enthusiasm. Adaeze noticed the difference in warmth immediately, the careful smiles, the polite distance, but she told herself it was simply unfamiliarity, the kind of thing that softens with time and effort. She arrived at the Mensah family compound in Accra with 2 suitcases holding everything she owned and one folded piece of kente cloth that had belonged to her grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women in her family, each of whom had carried it into a new home the way Adaeze now carried it into hers. It was not valuable in money. It was valuable in everything else. A reminder her mother had told her the morning she left, that where you come from is not something you outgrow. It is something you carry forward, the way the Sankofa bird carries what matters, even as it flies ahead. Standing in the wide, tiled courtyard of the Mensah compound for the first time, watching Mama Ijeoma's eyes move slowly and silently over her second-hand shoes and simple travelling dress, Adaeze had no way of knowing how much she would need to remember that lesson in the months to come. The Mensah compound was larger than anything Adaeze had grown up around a 2-story house with a wide veranda, a separate guest wing, and a courtyard shaded by a mango tree older than Chidi himself. It should have felt like the beginning of an easier life. Instead, from her very first morning there, Adaeze understood that she had entered a household with its own quiet hierarchy, and that she had been placed, without discussion, at the bottom of it. Mama Ijeoma assigned her kitchen duties before Adaeze had even finished unpacking her second suitcase. It was not framed as a request. A housegirl brought Adaeze's bags to a modest room near the back of the house, not the guest wing where visiting relatives stayed, but a smaller room typically used for extended domestic staff, and Mama Ijeoma appeared in the doorway only long enough to say that breakfast in this house was served at 6 and that she assumed Adaeze understood how to prepare a proper Ghanaian breakfast for a family of her husband's standing. It was not a question. Adaeze said that she did, though in truth her mother had taught her to cook out of necessity, not tradition, and she spent her first week quietly relearning dishes she'd never had reason to make before. Amara made her opinion of the marriage clear within days, though never directly to Adaeze's face. She had a way of speaking about her new sister-in-law as though Adaeze weren't in the room, even when she was standing 3 feet away. The market girl, she called her once, to a visiting cousin, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry. Chidi always did have a soft heart for strays. The cousin laughed, uncertain, glancing at Adaeze, who kept her eyes on the tray of drinks she was carrying, and said nothing. She had learned, long before she ever set foot in this compound, that responding to cruelty in the moment rarely changed the outcome. It only gave the cruelty an audience. The clearest instance of the family's estimation of her came 3 weeks into her marriage, during a small gathering to celebrate a cousin's engagement. The men had drifted, as they often did, into a conversation about the family's textile trading business, specifically a growing frustration with how difficult it had become to track inventory across their 2 warehouses, leading to costly mismatches between what records said they had and what was actually on the shelves. Adaeze, sitting nearby with the other women, listened for several minutes before she could no longer stay silent. She mentioned, carefully and quietly, that the problem sounded like it could be solved with a simple digital inventory system, nothing expensive, nothing complicated, just a shift away from paper ledgers that couldn't be cross-checked in real time. The table went quiet for a moment, and then Mr. Kwame Mensah, Chidi's father, chuckled not unkindly, but in the particular way adults sometimes laugh at a child who has said something earnest and slightly out of place. "Business is not a woman's place to speak on, my dear," he said, patting her hand as though to soften the words. Mama Ijeoma added, with a thin smile, that Adaeze was sweet to try to contribute, but that the family's business had survived for 3 generations without a computer telling it what to do, and it would survive for 3 more. Chidi, sitting across the table, said nothing at all. Adaeze watched his eyes flick toward her, apologetic, and then away the same pattern she would come to recognize over the following months, the silence of a man who loved her but had never learned how to spend his family's approval on her behalf. That night, alone in the small back room, Adaeze thought about her mother's face on the morning she'd left home, and the words she'd said while folding the kente cloth into Adaeze's suitcase with careful hands. "Patience is not the same as weakness," her mother had told her. "A river does not force its way through stone. It simply keeps moving, and in time, the stone gives way." Adaeze had nodded then, without fully understanding what the words would cost her to live by. She understood now. She lay awake that night, turning the memory over, and made a decision she did not share with anyone, not Chidi, not her mother, not even herself in so many words. She would not spend her energy trying to convince this family of her worth. She would simply continue being herself, fully, quietly, in the one place they could not see her, the work she had already spent years building, long before any of them had a say in who she was allowed to be. She thought, too, about something her old cafe owner cousin used to say, half as a joke, whenever a client doubted whether Adaeze's young, unassuming, a woman could really solve their business problems, as well as she claimed. "Let them underestimate you," he would say. "It only means you'll surprise them twice, once with the result, and once with how long you let them believe otherwise." Adaeze closed her eyes that night, with the kente cloth folded on the pillow beside her, and made a silent promise to the version of herself who had once taken apart a broken radio just to understand it. She would not let this house make her smaller than she was. She would simply wait for the right moment to be seen. What the Mensah family never knew, what Adaeze made certain they never knew, was that she had not stopped working the day she walked through their gate. If anything, marriage had given her something she'd never had before, uninterrupted hours after the household went to sleep, when the compound fell quiet and no one questioned where she was or what she was doing behind a closed door. She had built Okonjo Consulting slowly, over nearly 4 years, starting with a single client, a fabric shop owner near her hometown who could not understand why his stock counts never matched his sales records. Adaeze had built him a simple spreadsheet system, explained it patiently over 2 visits, and watched his monthly losses from unaccounted inventory disappear almost entirely within a season. He told 2 other shop owners. They told others. By the time she married Chidi, Okonjo Consulting had a modest but steadily growing client base of small and mid-sized traders across 2 regions, all of whom knew her only as a calm, precise voice on scheduled calls and a name at the bottom of clean, well-organized reports. None of them had ever met her in person. That had always been by design. A young woman running a business consultancy alone invited a particular kind of skepticism she preferred to avoid, and the distance let her work speak before her face ever could. In the Mensah compound, this work became her sanctuary. After the last of the evening dishes were cleared and the house settled into silence, Adaeze would retreat to her room, open the second-hand laptop she'd carried in her second suitcase, and become, for a few hours each night, someone the household had no idea existed, not the market girl, not the woman who had brought bad luck into the house, but a consultant whose calm, exacting judgment her clients trusted completely. She nearly lost that sanctuary once, in her 2nd month of marriage. Amara, restless and curious, wandered past Adaeze's door late one night and paused at the sound of a muted video call, Adaeze's voice, low and businesslike, discussing quarterly loss projections with a client in Kumasi. Amara knocked without waiting for a response and pushed the door open just as Adaeze ended the call, closing the laptop screen a half-second too late to fully hide it. "Who was that?" Amara asked, more curious than suspicious. Adaeze's heart pounded, but her voice stayed even. "A cousin," she said. "Checking on things back home." Amara studied her for a moment, shrugged, and left already bored by an explanation too ordinary to gossip about. Adaeze sat very still for a long time after the door closed, and then, carefully, she began locking it every night after that. It was during this period that she took on the client who would, without either of them realizing it, become the thread connecting her two separate lives. A textile manufacturing company on the outskirts of Accra reached out through a referral, struggling with the exact kind of inventory chaos she had built her entire practice around solving mismatched stock records, missed supplier deadlines, a warehouse system still run largely on memory and paper. The company's owner, a tired, polite man named Mr. Owusu, described his situation to her over their first call with a weariness Adaeze recognized instantly. It was the same weariness she'd heard at her own family's dinner table, the same fear of watching something built over decades slowly come apart. She began working with Mr. Owusu's company, the way she worked with all her clients methodically, patiently, one system at a time. Within 2 months, his warehouse losses had dropped by nearly a third. Word of her work began circulating quietly through Accra's small business community, the way good reputations do, not loudly, not publicly, but in the specific, trusted way. One struggling business owner mentions a solution to another over a shared frustration. She was becoming known, cautiously, as AOA. A consultant who didn't take meetings in person, didn't advertise, and somehow always seemed to know exactly what a failing system needed. Adaeze had no way of knowing, typing her reports late at night in a borrowed room in her husband's family compound, that the name being passed quietly between desperate business owners in Accra would soon reach the ears of the very family that had told her only weeks earlier that business was not a woman's place to speak on. She only knew that for a few hours each night, behind a locked door, she was exactly who she had always known herself to be, and that knowledge, more than any recognition the Mensah family could offer her, was enough to carry her through each day that followed. The Mensah family trading business had survived 3 generations, but survival, Mr. Kwame Mensah was beginning to understand in the quiet hours he spent alone with the account books, was not the same as strength. For years, the warning signs had been small enough to ignore a shipment delayed here, a stock discrepancy corrected there, losses absorbed and forgotten in the rhythm of a business that had always found a way through. But small signs, left unaddressed long enough, have a way of becoming large ones. Competitors who had modernized their operations years earlier, digital inventory systems, streamlined supplier contracts, real-time tracking across warehouses had slowly begun outpacing the Mensah trading house in efficiency, in pricing, in the ability to fulfill large orders on time. What had once been a matter of pride for Kwame Mensah, a business built on relationships and instinct rather than spreadsheets, was becoming a liability he could no longer explain away to his most important clients. Contracts that had been with the family for over a decade were being quietly reconsidered. A major supplier relationship, one that accounted for nearly a third of the company's textile stock, had sent a formal letter expressing concern over repeated fulfillment delays. Kwame said little of this at home. He was a proud man, raised to believe that a family's business troubles were carried privately, discussed only among the men who bore responsibility for them. But pride, like patience, has its costs, and the weight of carrying a failing business alone had begun to show in the sleepless nights, in the sharper edge to his voice, in the way he now studied every expense in the household with a scrutiny that had never existed before. Mama Ijoma noticed the change in her husband long before anyone spoke of it directly. She noticed, too, that the timing of the family's troubles aligned, in her mind, disturbingly well with the arrival of her new daughter-in-law, a a coincidence she could not fully rationalize away, though she would never have admitted, even to herself, how much simpler it was to believe in bad luck than to examine 3 generations of business decisions that had gone unquestioned for far too long. It is easier, sometimes, to find a person to blame than a system to fix. The tension in the household reached its first real breaking point at a birthday celebration meant to honor Kwame's 60th year, an occasion the family had planned for months, inviting extended relatives, longtime business associates, and neighbors whose good opinion mattered to the Mensa name. Adaeze spent the 2 days before the event helping prepare food and arrange the compound, moving quietly through tasks no one thanked her for, understanding without being told that her presence at the celebration itself would be tolerated rather than welcomed. She was right to expect as much, though she could not have predicted how the evening would unfold. The gathering began warmly enough music, laughter, the easy comfort of old friends catching up over shared plates. But as the evening wore on, and a few of Kwame's closest business associates drew him aside to discuss, quietly but visibly, the recent troubles with the supplier contract, the warmth in the courtyard began to thin. Word travels quickly at a gathering of people who have known each other for decades, and by the time dessert was served, a current of concern had spread through the guests, polite on the surface, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Amara, perhaps sensing the mood and looking for somewhere to direct it, was the first to bring Adaeze's name into the conversation, murmuring to a cousin within earshot of several guests that things really did start going wrong. Around the same time, someone joined this family who has no business sense at all. It was said lightly, almost as a joke, but Adaeze felt every eye that turned briefly toward her in response. She kept her expression steady, continuing to refill a tray of drinks, though something in her chest tightened at the casual cruelty of it, not because it was new, but because it was now being said in front of witnesses. Chidi, standing nearby, heard it too. For a moment, something in his posture shifted a flicker of the man who had once told Adaeze, during their courtship, that he admired how she solved problems instead of avoiding them. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. He said nothing, glancing instead toward his father, whose tired face had grown even more drawn as the evening went on. Adaeze noticed the glance, and understood it perfectly. Tonight was not a night Chidi would choose to defend her, not with his father's dignity already fraying in front of half of Accra's business community. As the last guests began to leave, offering Kwame their condolences dressed up as birthday wishes, Adaeze felt the particular exhaustion of having spent an entire evening being both invisible and blamed at once, present enough to be talked about, unimportant enough that no one thought to include her in the conversation about how to fix what was breaking. She had no way of knowing, clearing the final trays from the courtyard as the compound emptied into a tense, uneasy quiet, that the true reckoning of that evening, the one that would decide far more than any birthday celebration, was still 3 weeks away, and that it would begin with her mother-in-law's finger pointed directly at her chest. The 3 weeks following Kwame's birthday celebration passed in a slow unraveling that everyone in the household could feel, but few were willing to name aloud. The formal letter from their largest supplier, once a quiet concern, became an ultimatum. Resolve the pattern of fulfillment delays within 30 days, or the contract and the third of the company's textile stock it represented would move to a competitor who had already modernized its systems. Kwame Mensah, 60 years old and watching 3 generations of his family's legacy narrow toward a single deadline, began spending entire days locked in his study with account books that offered him no new answers, no matter how many times he reread them. The pressure in the household found its outlet the way pressure often does, not in the study where the real problem lived, but in the courtyard on an ordinary evening over something almost incidental. Adaeze had gone to the market that afternoon, as she often did, and returned later than expected after helping an elderly neighbor carry her purchases home, a small kindness that cost her perhaps 20 extra minutes. She arrived back at the compound gate just as Mama Ijeoma was stepping outside to look for her, already irritated by a delayed dinner preparation, and carrying, Adaeze would later understand, 3 weeks of unspoken fear about her husband's failing business, fear that had nowhere else left to go. "Where have you been?" Mama Ijeoma demanded, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard, drawing the attention of a neighbor watering plants over the low wall next door. Adaeze began to explain the elderly neighbor, the heavy bags, the simple decency of helping, but Mama Ijeoma was no longer listening. Something in her had reached its limit, and it broke open all at once. 3 weeks of fear finding, at last, a shape it could point at. "You have brought nothing but bad luck into this family," she said, her finger extended, trembling slightly, directly at Adaeze's chest. "Since the day you walked through that gate, nothing in this house has gone right. My husband cannot sleep. This business, 3 generations, is falling apart in his hands. And you stand there with your quiet ways and your market bags, as if none of it touches you." Amara, drawn outside by the raised voice, appeared in the doorway and said nothing to defend Adaeze, only crossed her arms, and let a faint, unmistakable smile settle over her face, not of cruelty exactly, but of quiet vindication, as though this moment confirmed something she had believed all along. Chidi arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion, and stopped several feet away, his eyes moving between his mother's furious face and his wife's still, composed one. Adaeze waited for him to speak. He did not. The silence stretched, long enough that it became its own kind of answer, and something in Adaeze's chest, not anger exactly, but a quiet, final understanding settled into place. She did not raise her voice. She did not remind Mama Ijeoma of the evening months earlier, when she had tried to offer a solution to the very problem now breaking the family apart, only to be told that business was not a woman's place to speak on. She did not point out that the company's failures had begun years before she'd ever set foot in this compound, in decisions made by men who had never once considered that a woman's perspective might have value. She simply held her grandmother's kente cloth tighter against her chest. She had been carrying it that day, wrapped around a small gift she'd bought for a neighbor's child, and let the silence stretch until Mama Ijeoma, having said everything she needed to say, turned and walked back into the house. That night, alone in her room, with the door locked, Adaeze allowed herself, finally, to feel the full weight of the evening, not with tears, though they threatened, but with a stillness that felt almost like grief. She thought of her mother's words again, the ones about the river and the stone, and wondered, for the first time since arriving in this compound, whether patience alone was truly enough, or whether some stones simply never gave way. But grief, in Adaeze, had never been the kind of feeling that stopped her hands from moving. She opened her laptop because a client was waiting on a report she had promised by morning, and because the discipline of the work had always been, for her, a kind of anchor when everything else felt unmoored. The client was Mr. Owusu, whose textile company's supplier crisis had grown more urgent in recent weeks. Urgent enough, he'd mentioned on their last call that he'd begun quietly recommending her, by initials only, to other business owners he knew were struggling with the same kind of systemic failure. "Everyone in Accra's trading circles is talking about A.O., he'd told her, with a note of pride in having found her before anyone else had. "I heard someone even mentioned your initials at a business dinner last week, some family with a textile contract about to collapse." Adaeze had smiled faintly at that, typing her response without a second thought, with no way of knowing that the family, Mr. Owusu, had overheard discussing her initials at a dinner 3 weeks earlier was her own. The supplier's 30-day deadline arrived with the company no closer to a solution than it had been a month earlier, and Kwame Mensah, watching the last of his patience and his pride dissolve into the same desperate arithmetic, finally did what he had resisted doing for years. He asked for help outside the family. It was a business associate, one of the same men who had drawn him aside at his birthday celebration, who mentioned the name again, this time with more insistence. "There's a consultant everyone's been talking about," the associate said over a tense lunch meeting. goes by initials only, AO. Doesn't take meetings, works entirely by phone and email, but I've heard of 2 companies this year alone that were on the edge of losing everything and came back stronger than before she got involved. Owusu's textile operation, for one, you know him, near the industrial road, swears by her. Kwame, out of options and running low on time, asked for the contact information before he'd fully decided whether he believed the recommendation. The email he sent that evening was more formal than he intended, a mixture of pride and desperation that he tried, not entirely successfully, to keep out of the tone. A responded within a day, as she always did, with a short, professional message requesting an overview of the company's current systems and a proposed initial call to assess the scope of the problem. Kwame agreed immediately, relieved simply to have found someone willing to look at the wreckage seriously. Over the following week, Adaeze, working, as always, from the same locked room in the same compound she had lived in for over a year, began receiving documents from a new client identified only as Mensa Trading Company. She did not connect the name immediately. Mensa was common enough, and she had long ago trained herself to approach every client's records with the same detached, methodical attention regardless of who they were. It was only on the 3rd document, a supplier correspondence file with her father-in-law's full signature at the bottom, that the recognition arrived cold and sudden, the way realization sometimes does, all at once instead of gradually. She sat very still for a long moment, the laptop's glow the only light in the room, and understood immediately the particular position she now occupied. The family that had called her bad luck, that had told her business was not a woman's place to speak on, that had pointed a finger at her chest in the courtyard 3 weeks earlier, was now unknowingly asking her, begging her, in the increasingly urgent tone of Kwame's follow-up emails to save them. She could have declined. No one would have known why, and she could have protected herself from whatever discomfort the reveal might bring. But Adaeze had never built her consulting practice on convenience, and she was not about to abandon a client, even this one, simply because the truth was complicated. She responded to Kwame's email the way she responded to every client in a crisis serious enough to warrant it. She agreed to an in-person meeting, the first she had ever granted in 4 years of practice, on the condition that it take place at the company's own primary location, so she could assess the physical operations directly. Kwame, thrilled and relieved, agreed to every condition without hesitation, and scheduled the meeting for the following week at the family compound's adjoining office, the same courtyard where, weeks earlier, his wife had told his daughter-in-law she had brought nothing but bad luck into the house. The morning of the meeting, Adaeze dressed with more care than she had allowed herself since her wedding day, not out of vanity, but because she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent a year being underestimated, exactly what this moment required of her. She left the compound early, telling no one where she was going, and returned 2 hours later through the front gate rather than the side entrance she usually used, carrying a laptop bag instead of market bags, walking with the same calm, unhurried posture Chidi had first noticed at her cousin's wedding. Mama Ijeoma was the one who opened the door, expecting the consultant her husband had been anxiously preparing for all morning. Her welcoming smile, already forming, froze midway as recognition arrived slow at first, then all at once, the way it always does when the mind refuses an obvious truth until it has no choice left. Behind her, Amara's designer bag slipped slightly off her shoulder as she stared, momentarily forgetting to catch it. Chidi, appearing in the doorway behind his mother, said nothing at all, but for the first time in over a year, his silence carried something other than avoidance. It carried the particular stillness of a man finally seeing, in full, someone he had loved without ever fully understanding. Kwame said slowly, looking at his daughter-in-law standing in the courtyard with a laptop bag over her shoulder and an expression that gave nothing away. "It's you." Adaeze met his eyes, and for the first time since she had walked through this gate over a year earlier, She did not lower them. No one spoke for a long moment. The courtyard held the particular silence of a room, recalibrating everything it thought it understood. Each member of the family, running back through months of small cruelties and dismissals, now framed in an entirely different light. Adaeze let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to, and then she did the thing she had come to do. She did not raise her voice. She did not remind them of the birthday celebration, or the courtyard accusation, or the year of kitchen duties and quiet condescension. She simply set her laptop bag down on the same table where, months earlier, she had been told that business was not a woman's place to speak on, opened it, and said, "Here is what I would change first." What followed, over the next several weeks, was not a dramatic reversal, but a methodical one, the same patient, unglamorous work Adaeze had always done for every client, applied now to the family that had spent a year failing to see her clearly. She rebuilt the company's inventory tracking from the ground up, digitizing records that had existed only on paper for 3 generations. She renegotiated the terms of the endangered supplier contract, presenting a fulfillment timeline detailed enough that the supplier agreed, cautiously, to extend the partnership. She identified, within the first week, 2 warehouse inefficiencies that alone accounted for nearly a fifth of the company's recent losses, the exact kind of finding she had once tried to explain at a family dinner table, dismissed then as a woman's misplaced enthusiasm. Kwame Mensah, watching his company stabilize in a matter of weeks after years of slow decline, did not know how to reconcile the daughter-in-law he had dismissed with the consultant who had saved his family's legacy. He said little about it directly, but Adaeze noticed the change in the way he addressed her, no longer with the polite condescension of before, but with a wary, growing respect that showed itself in small ways. Asking her opinion before making a decision, deferring to her judgment on matters he would never have considered a woman's place to weigh in on a year earlier. Mama Ijioma's reckoning was slower and less complete. She never offered the apology Adaeze might once have hoped for, the acknowledgement of the courtyard accusation or the year of dismissiveness that preceded it. Pride, Adaeze had come to understand, does not dissolve simply because the facts that supported it disappear. It recedes slowly, reluctantly, one small concession at a time. But she noticed, over the following months, that her mother-in-law had stopped assigning her kitchen duties without asking, had begun, hesitantly, to ask her thoughts on household matters she would once have decided alone, and once, only once. In a moment, neither of them acknowledged directly afterward, thanked her, quietly, for staying. Amara's transformation was, in its own way, the most visible. The confident condescension that had once coloured every interaction softened into something closer to genuine curiosity. She began asking Adaeze, tentatively at first, how she had built her consulting practice alone, whether it was something Amara herself might learn. Adaeze answered honestly and patiently, the way she answered every question from someone genuinely willing to learn, without holding the past against her the way she might once have felt entitled to. Chidi's reckoning was the quietest, and in some ways the most important to Adaeze. Late one evening, weeks after the reveal, he found her in the courtyard, the same spot where his mother had once pointed a finger at her chest and told her, haltingly, that he was sorry for every moment he had chosen silence over her defense, that he had let his family's approval matter more than her dignity, and that he understood now, fully, what she had been carrying alone for over a year. Adaeze listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she told him the truth, that she had not needed his family's apology to know her own worth, but that she was glad, for both their sakes, that he had finally found the courage to see her clearly. She did not tell him, because some things are understood, rather than explained, that she had never once needed the Mensah family's recognition to know who she was. She had known it in a rented hour at an internet cafe at 12 years old, taking apart a broken radio to understand its parts. She had known it in every quiet report she'd typed by lamplight for clients who trusted a name they'd never seen a face behind. Their recognition, when it finally came, was not the thing that had made her enough. It was simply the moment the rest of the world caught up to what she had always carried within her. Like the Sankofa bird, whose wings carry it forward, even as its head turns back toward everything that came before, Adaeze had never needed to leave her past behind to build her future. She had carried her grandmother's kente cloth into a house that once called her bad luck, and she carried it still not as a reminder of what she had endured, but as proof of everything she had never stopped being long before anyone else was willing to see it.